This episode of the Beyond the Physics podcast is brought to you by you. So if you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review and consider subscribing at patreon.com/Beyond the Physics. This is Beyond the Physics. All right, hi everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Physics. This is Joseph Guzman. So we got a bit of an atypical episode for you, and that's in a few different ways. The first is that it's just going to be me tonight. Irene will be back for future podcasts, right? So don't you fret. If you need your Irene time, she's still part of the team, and we'll be back shortly. The second way that this is probably going to be atypical of most episodes is that it's going to be shorter, probably considerably shorter. I'm just planning on monologuing. I don't have a script. I don't have in-depth notes like I usually do. All I have is some brief bullet points of like major beats that I want to hit on today's episode. So it might be a little bit more loose than you're used to, but hopefully that's okay. And so I'm going to be giving y'all some homework, I guess you could say, some things that I've learned from simply watching TV, but I thought it was a pretty powerful technique, something that I just naturally applied and came up with on my own. And so I'll get into more detail about that in a second, but first I figure we should take a couple minutes to catch up on what I've been up to and why I haven't recorded a podcast and that kind of stuff, just real quick. So it's been a while since we've recorded a podcast. I think it's been about a year since we last left off. We recorded some stuff with the Eigenbros. But since then, the major things that have happened for me in the program, I've passed the qualification exam. So for those of you who don't recall, I am in a PhD physics program, and most PhD programs require you to pass a written exam. And the way my school has it set up is, there's 4 different tests that covers all of physics. You have classical mechanics, thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, electricity and magnetism, and quantum mechanics. And so left off, I was probably, I don't exactly recall, I was probably getting ready to take it for the first time. And so I passed half of the exams that first go around, and then I think the second exam was on my birthday in December, and I ended up passing the other 2 on my second attempt. So I had 1 attempt to spare. So anyways, that's a big relief. I was really convinced. I truly did not believe that I would have passed that test, but I did. So I surprised myself, and that's great news. And so the thing that happened immediately after that is after, passing the quals, that immediately started the process for what we call the prospectus. Again, most PhD programs not only require a written exam, but they often have an oral exam as well. And so for our oral exam, basically we call it the prospectus, and you're supposed to present the idea for your PhD, right? Like, what's your proposed PhD dissertation? Can you get it done in a few years or whatever? And what are the details of your plan? So that's what the prospectus is, and I was working really hard to try to finish that part, to finish my prospectus. And I kind of put a lot of my life on hold for that because it seemed like a pretty intense thing, and I was really looking forward to having that done. And once you successfully defend your prospectus, you're what's known as a PhD candidate, and then the way people communicate about it, it's a little bit easier of a road than when you first start graduate school. So I thought, let me just knock this out of the way, and then hopefully I'll have more space to do things like record podcasts and, do some more of the things that, I like doing. Unfortunately, there's been some traumatic shit that has fallen out of this process of doing the prospectus, things that I did not expect. And so I'm not going to go into those details as much as I want to, but we will be doing a podcast about that soon, right? But so, anyways, I was getting close to present, so maybe soon I'll be doing the prospectus. Who knows what the fuck will happen? It's a pretty chaotic time. Right, so I envisioned recording this podcast in an entirely different mental space. So this thing that's come up really takes up a lot of my processing, and puts a whole new twist on my plan of recording this thing that seems like totally unrelated. But I still think it's valuable. I think it could be good for me to recap some of these things and kind of distract myself from that whole situation. So anyways, so I passed the quals. I'm, working on my prospectus, trying to become a PhD candidate. Things were progressing along at a pretty quick pace. And there's been a lot of shit that's happened in between. It's been a really crazy year. It's been very difficult. So many things. And again, we'll probably devote a whole podcast to unraveling more details around that, because some things have happened that have drastically changed our lives, probably forever. So but that's not the point of this podcast. I just wanted to briefly tell you what's up and why I haven't checked in, and let you know I haven't forgotten about you. Okay. Cool. So if that's enough chit chat out of the way, why don't we start talking about today's episode, right? So you've probably seen the title, How Moon Knight Changed My Life, right? And that's not me trying to be clickbaity, or anything, but I feel like it genuinely has changed my life. I've learned so much about myself through this exercise. And I thought it might be valuable for you guys to hear about it. I've talked about it a lot already. I talked about it with my therapist. I talked about it with my family, with my friends, with Irene. And, so I have a lot of, experience around talking about this thing. And so that's why I guess I feel a little bit more comfortable just winging it and just, kind of doing this a little bit looser. But so before I go straight into the lessons and how to apply this, I think y'all will need some context. So if you haven't seen the show Moon Knight, it's on Disney Plus. I'm going to try to avoid talking about that many specific things that happen in the show, because that's not really, while it did provide, while the show was ultimately the thing that got me to think deeply about myself and get these insights, a lot of the details around the show aren't necessary to extract the value out of what I'm trying to tell you about. But there are some basic fundamentals that you should know about. so that we could all get on the same page. So in general, there won't be that many spoilers, but that being said, if you want to watch the show, I can totally recommend it. So now's a good time to pause it, go watch the show, and then come back if you'd like. Okay, so now that we're all here and agreed to go for the long haul, so I watched Moon Knight not long after it came out, and I believe that was in 2022, so just a year ago. It naturally made me come to important realizations about who I am, who I want to be, and these insights I gained through watching the show really provided a sense of clarity, of growth, of understanding. It made me feel more confident about about what's important to me, and feel a little bit more self-assured and empowered in how I move through the world. Right? If you're making decisions and you haven't really paused to evaluate, like, who are you? Like, what do you want in life? Like, what motivates you and why? It can be kind of debilitating. It can be kind of confusing, and yeah, you can feel lost in terms of what to do next. So anyways, that's kind of how this exercise has changed me. The context for the show now is that the basic thing that you should know is that in Moon Knight, the protagonist has dissociative identity disorder, or some version of it, DID for short. And the first personality that we're introduced to, his name is Steven, right? So Steven works at the History Museum. He comes across as a generally sensitive and caring and shy person. You know, you see him call his mother, he goes on a date, and, you know, in general, he seems pretty meek, but, you know, intelligent and an emotional being. Later, we meet his other persona, who goes by the name Marc. So Marc is kind of almost the opposite, in that Marc is a stoic, deadly mercenary. You know, Marc is a very capable person, but he's kind of emotionally stunted, right? So you can see that he has an estranged wife, and they communicate very poorly, and, you know, she describes how he's not very emotionally available, very much not Steven, and why, ironically, she finds Steven much more attractive than Marc in the show. But so Marc, canonically, given his skill set, he's the one that is the Moon Knight. He's the one that's the superhero, right? Because he's the mercenary that knows all the combat skills and is, you know, can push aside his feelings and remain stoic in the face of these adversities or whatever. So that's Moon Knight. There's Marc and Steven. Marc is very serious and stern, and Steven is, you know, very, you know, vulnerable, you know, emotional and sensitive. So to understand the connections that I'm about to make, I think I should provide you some context about what was going on in my life, where I was when I was watching this show, and how I was able to make the connections that I did. And then maybe you could start trying to consider doing the same for yourself. Right, so while I was watching Moon Knight, I was in the middle of a crisis of my own. Right, so I briefly even mentioned this in the introduction, is that, you know, I've been in graduate school for, you know, 4+ years at this point when I'm watching this show. And at this time, I was seriously considering quitting the program. One problem was that I was feeling very stuck around this decision. I was feeling, perhaps indecisive is one way you could describe it, but it felt stronger than that. I had done so much processing around, why the program wasn't serving me, like, what did I want to do afterwards? Did I really need this degree? It seems like for my goals, like, I don't know why I need a PhD. The program just in general feels like a pretty toxic environment that, even outside of my own internal issues, like externally, the program and just being in graduate school in general and in the academic culture, I think, is also just kind of fucked up. Like, there's so much exploitation. You get such little respect. I've experienced abuse, emotional abuse, not physical, to be clear, emotional abuse by my supervisors. Like, is it worth it? Like, what? Anyway, so my point is like, I had done all this processing, I identified all these ways that this program was like bad for me, and all these reasons that, even now seem like very valid. Valid reasons for leaving the program. The problem is no matter how much processing I would do around this situation, I couldn't bring myself to finally commit the deed and leave the program. Like, I'd make a pros and cons list, and the cons list would be a mile long, and the pros would be like, a few bullets. But it didn't matter, right? It's like, it kind of felt as though my mind wanted one thing, but my body wanted another. It's like I was trapped inside of my body. I was an onlooker onto this like catastrophe that was unfolding before my eyes. Like, one way I've described it in the past is like, it felt like my body was on railroad tracks, and I just have to watch in horror as it is going to continue going through this PhD program, whether I like it or not. So that was a very bizarre experience to be in. So it's like, that's the level of stuckness that I'm talking about. Like, when I'm saying I'm stuck, it's like, literally, I felt like I didn't have control over my body, or, it was just, it's like, it's an experience that I haven't really felt before, but maybe that sounds a little less crazy than it feels right now. But anyway, so some more context around, like, I was pausing to consider quitting the program. There was obviously some other like major things going on at the time that led to this decision. One was the qualification exam, right? A lot of my closest friends had been kicked out of the program because they hadn't passed the test in a time manner that seemed appropriate to the department, right? And when I try to evaluate my skills, I felt like I was on a level that was similar to my closest friends, and they got kicked out. So what are the odds that I'm going to pass? I felt a lot of anxiety around that. The other thing going on, obviously, was COVID, right? So for all the bad COVID brought into the world, one of the good things, I guess you could say, is that it gave me and the world a moment to pause and reflect on what is going on in their life, right? It gave me a moment to pause, and it gave me the space to think about, like, wait, what am I doing here? Like, why am I going through this? Like, is this really necessary? Do I need this PhD? So yeah, COVID definitely provided the space to do that. And, people around me, other graduate students, I heard about, many other students taking a break. And, I looked to their example, and I thought that was, maybe not such a bad idea. I mean, the other thing I'd like to acknowledge about, why I was trying to leave, while I was considering to leaving the program, was I was not very happy, but in a way that it felt clear that it was the source of my unhappiness, right? Like, in one of my previous updates around, like, what I was doing around the break is I just, started trying to take care of my body and stuff, and, whatever. And I'll probably go into more details about that soon. But basically, it was clear to me that the work, being in the PhD program, was making me miserable, right? And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that experience. Like having a job that they don't like very much, and just doing it to support the ones that they care about, or just in general feeling stuck in, a situation that doesn't bring them much joy, feeling like they're trapped for whatever reason. That's kind of where I was at, and I was trying to evaluate whether I really was stuck. Can I just leave? I mean, there's a bit of the sunk cost fallacy that goes into it, and, like, I've already gotten so far, like, it would be a waste to, throw that away. Anyways, sorry, I'm kind of rambling. So let's get it back on track. So, basically, I was feeling burnt out, at the time, and the middle option was seeming more and more appealing to me, in the sense of taking a break, but not fully stepping out of the program. So in taking a break, my reasoning was that, I can easily recognize that I'm burnt out, I'm overworked, and I wondered if I had some more space to, like, take care of myself and to rejuvenate and recharge my batteries, like, would a love of physics return? Would a new perspective be instilled within me to, like, find more gratitude and joy in the work that I was doing as a result of recharging my batteries and hopefully no longer being burnt out? So as a result, I decided to take this break and try to be really mindful of, like, okay, how do I feel about going back now that I'm here? Getting an outside perspective on the situation. So anyways, this is where I am at when I'm watching Moon Knight. I'm really in this, like, very, like, heady internal space, so it kind of explains why I developed the exercise I did, right? Like, I'm going to a lot of therapy at this moment. I'm trying to take care of my body. I'm doing all of this emotional processing, trying to figure out, like, who I am and what I want, and should I stay in this program? Should I stay or should I go now, right? And then I start watching Moon Knight, right? So as I'm watching Moon Knight and I see, Marc and Steven, they're constantly in conflict, right? They're very different personalities. I find myself naturally thinking, like, who's my Marc and who's my Steven? And this is the exercise that I recommend for all of you listening at this moment, is to try to evaluate like whether you have similar personas as Marc or Steven. They could be drastically different, right? They don't have to be as masculine or whatever, but like, I found it pretty straightforward to identify aspects within myself that much more closely aligned with Marc, and then aspects within myself that much more aligned with Steven. Right, so let me try to outline how I go about defining my Marc and my Steven. So this is one thing that I'm realizing is going to be confusing, is that from now on, when I talk about Marc or Steven, I'm going to be referring to my Marc and my Steven, who are not the same as the characters on the show, right? Unless I say otherwise, and just to be clear, I don't think I have dissociative identity disorder. I mean, you're talking to Joe right now. You're not talking to Marc or Steven or whatever. This is just a mental exercise to try to figure out aspects of my personality, right? So anyways, let's talk about Marc, where he comes from. So growing up, I had defined my self-worth through my work. I had singularly devoted myself to busting my ass off, basically since high school, and not really taking a break aside from the one I just mentioned, a year ago. In high school and undergrad, I would neglect my body frequently for the sake of work. I would work 15 hours a day. I would sleep 5-6 hours every day for years. So this is where Marc started to come into existence. This is where he becomes fully instantiated as his own entity, as a defining aspect of who I am. So Marc was capable of working beyond his limits, right? Many people, when they get this type of signal that they're neglecting their body, very reasonably probably take that as a signal to stop. But Marc was capable of pushing past those signals. Naturally he was very high achieving, right? He thought that security and stability were the most important things in life, and that he wouldn't be safe until he got the next achievement. And then once you get the next achievement, you're not safe until you get the next achievement, right? It's like, I have a master's degree in physics, and yet I still don't feel safe. This comes from Marc. Marc strives to be the perfect person, right? He's not satisfied with stagnation. You could almost say that he's obsessed with personal growth. So you could probably guess now how Marc viewed the graduate program and the prospect of getting a PhD. This is something that was absolutely necessary, or Marc or I'm not really sure how to talk about this stuff. It's kind of weird, but or I would risk being a failure. The outcome of not getting the PhD would get catastrophized, right? It would be like I would end up homeless without the external validation of this piece of paper of the PhD. I would end up homeless with no one who cared for me. The worst, the worst possible future. That's what Marc viewed as, inevitable if you were to relax. But, on one side, this fear and anxiety was adaptive in some sense, right? It was motivating. It would push me to work harder and to go farther than many of my peers around me. So this is how Marc weaponizes fear and anxiety to become the superhero, to become Moon Knight, right? Through having so much discomfort in sitting with the fear and anxiety of being a failure, he can do superhuman things, right? He can neglect his body. He can work harder and longer than many people around him. And that propelled him to, a certain level of success. However, graduate school was the first time that Marc had begun to face challenges that he couldn't simply outwork. I would pull similar tactics of pushing my body past its limits, of, not sleeping much, of working insane hours, of even new things of like not eating much, cutting back time on eating, lunch or dinner to do more work. And it didn't matter, no matter how hard I or Marc worked, it didn't matter. Marc still experienced failure, especially at the beginning of the graduate school program. But even now, I constantly feel like no matter how hard I try, I still am not living up to expectations and failing in this program, And yeah, anyways, I'll just pause, take a moment to reflect that a lot of that is internal work of my own expectations, but now I'm seeing in many ways in which the external world is, judging and having their own expectations and saying that you're a failure as well. Right. And so that's tough to sit with. But anyways, so if the natural question that comes up is if Marc was willing to sacrifice literally everything for success, but then he still fails, why does he exist? What is the point of that sacrifice if you're not gonna get the one thing that you're striving for, right? Like you're gonna give up your body and your mind. You're gonna go crazy to fail in graduate school. Like, what's the point in that? That just seems like nonsense. So yeah, here's the problem with identifying your worth through your work, right? Who do you become without it? So I sat in this liminal space of like, who am I, right? Like I thought I was the person that, worked hard, was, resilient and overcame adversity, whatever, But, yeah, so I continued on this path, sacrificing everything to barely scrape by for years. But it's this discomfort that led to this identity work at the end of the day, I would say, is like to avoid the discomfort of being lost without success. I began to try to figure out like, okay, well, who am I? Like, who do I want to be? Like if I'm not my work, because I don't want to be a failure, then who am I really? So, at the time of my break, this is when a new identity began to crystallize and clash with Marc. This is where Steven came into existence, or became a more fully fledged part of my persona, I guess you could say. So I realized how fickle my previous identity was, I tried to explore like other role models in my life, like what examples do I have in the world, to try to figure out like who I am or who I want to be. Like, what does that question even mean? And so I just looked out into the world and I asked myself the questions like, who are the people that I respect most and why? I found that the people I respected most were the people that were patient, that displayed compassion and empathy and all these, quote unquote, soft skills. Those are the things that I really appreciated in a human being, more so than any ability in physics or any other skill for that matter. Those were the qualities that I valued the most. And that was something I learned about myself. So Steven was more concerned with emotional intelligence, I guess you can say. He viewed work as an ends to finding meaning, right? So you should work on things that give your life meaning and that you think are important and provide joy and so on. He viewed happiness as success, not external validation. He was unafraid to be vulnerable or to speak truth to power. He wanted to uplift everyone around him. He valued creativity, stories, art, podcasts like this. Steven was the person that I hadn't realized is who I was working to become all along. So once I had defined these aspects within myself, it became immediately clear why I felt stuck. Right? Marc and Steven, my Marc and my Steven, have completely opposite views of how to handle the PhD program. So, yeah, let me just pause to highlight how this could be helpful, I guess, is like, I was feeling really confused around this time. Like, why, if everything's so shitty in this program, why am I still here? Why am I doing this to myself? Why can't I just leave? I guess there was a lot of judgment around, around myself and like what I knew to be the right decision, but for some reason I couldn't bring myself to do it. And so this show of Moon Knight, I found it really cathartic. In doing this exercise of defining my Marc and my Steven, I got to give myself more acceptance around, Marc believes these things because, that's how he grew up. These things carried on from when I was a kid. And, it makes perfect sense that Marc would believe these things and, and so on. So anyways, in other words, like Moon Knight had helped me identify these core aspects of my identity and more clearly view the conflict that was within myself. All right, Joe from the future here. I just wanted to chime in real quick at this point because now I've talked about some of the benefits of highlighting these different personas and how it's been useful for me. I have a family member who's gone through a type of psychotherapy called internal family systems. And as they were going through it, it struck me as like very similar to this exercise that I've been highlighting throughout this episode, without professional guidance or anything. So anyways, if this exercise struck you as interesting, there's a quick recommendation for you if you want to go down further this rabbit hole, to consider checking out internal family systems. I'll leave a link that kind of defines it and stuff like that down below in the show notes. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Let's get back to the show. Marc and Steven have exactly different views of how to handle graduate school. If it's not clear, let me just outline. Marc viewed leaving graduate school as this unacceptable failure. If you leave, the physics program, you are going to end up homeless and alone, and no one's going to love you. And you need these external validation, these external tokens of success. Whereas Steven was terrified that we would continue in the program no matter the cost, right? So like, one thought that occurred to me when I was taking this break that I found really bizarre was like, I noticed within myself that I was terrified of passing the qualification exam. Of actually passing it somehow felt more anxiety producing than just failing it. Because like, if I fail it, then it's just like, it's over, I'm done. I don't have to torture myself with this decision anymore. But passing it, then I guess you could say Steven was concerned that this would give Marc an excuse to come back into the fold, right? We would need to use Marc's skills again to survive in this graduate school program. And so Marc would put Steven back into the coffin. That's an expression that I'm using from the show, because I believe they literally tried to do that to each other in the show. But anyway, so Steven's concern was that we would begin to compromise on the values that we were working so hard to embody at this moment. Like, I was trying to develop all these new habits and routines around taking care of my body and going to therapy and, doing all this internal work and understanding myself and, trying to be more empathetic and compassionate and patient with all the people around me. That some of those things would begin to slip away to make space for Marc and his need for success. And yeah, so Steven was terrified of that. So, Steven was finally given the space to exist during this break. A chink had shown in Marc's armor. Marc wasn't perfect. And so Steven came to fill the void. But, if we're going to continue in this program, how much space is there really for Steven? This is a point from my therapist to give her credit. Is that Marc is the one that is extremely well resourced in the world. To explain what that means is, the graduate program or society in general encourages Marc to exist, whereas they shun Steven. Some reasons why this would be is like, obviously my advisors, professors, people who I work for would be more than happy to take advantage of Marc's willingness to sacrifice everything for them. And all they have to give him in exchange is some tokens of success. And not even that sometimes, right? And, Steven's tendency to speak truth to power, to be vulnerable, to prioritize his well-being, and to take space when, he felt it was necessary for, his body and his mind. These are things that are not encouraged pretty much in any workplace in the world at the moment. And, that should tell you some things about the state of the world about, that's fucked up. But, regardless of, whether it's right or wrong, the reality is, that's just the situation, is that Marc is the one that, people want because he's more productive. So as a result, Steven is the one that needs to fight to survive. To exist in the graduate program as Steven, as the person I want to become, it's going to be exhausting, right? Having to uphold these certain values, to be mindfully aware of everything that's going on around the program and how it's not meeting these needs and how I have to fight to take space for my body and my mind. That is exhausting. It's a lot easier to just, in some ways, it's a lot easier to just be Marc and, take the abuse and go on being, a stoic robot and get the job done. That's kind of what they expect out of you. At least that's my impression of my graduate school program. So, being Steven in grad school is just going to be much more difficult. So, anyways, this is kind of some of the realizations that I came to through watching Moon Knight. I came to identify who is my Marc, who is my Steven, what are their motivations, why are their motivations that? How can I take the skills and find the strengths in both of them and bring them closer to unity, right? And, accept the quote unquote weaknesses of Marc and of Steven to give them validation around these things, to not be so harsh in my judgments of Marc or of Steven. These things I found profoundly changed my perspective of who I was. It provided so much clarity of who I wanted to be. And like I said, it really, I think to this day, I think it helps me figure out how I want to navigate my day-to-day existence. How do I be more authentic and engage in every situation with integrity, right? Knowing that, Steven has these values, and Marc has these values. Yeah. So that's currently what I'm working on now is ultimately I've decided to stay in the program and I've passed the qualification exam. So Steven's fear didn't come to fruition. He's not back in the coffin. But, in some sense, like with the prospectus and putting everything on hold, that is some tactics that Marc would pull, But anyways, Steven still exists, right? So I've been working on bringing them closer to integration, which I think is the healthier place to be. So that's basically what I had to share about my experience of watching Moon Knight, of who's my Marc, who's my Steven. So my homework for all of you listening, if you're still listening to this point, is to, consider who's your Marc, who's your Steven. And then if you haven't already, going to the deeper, more fundamental questions around that of who am I? Who do I want to be? Why do I want to be that person? And hopefully that helps you be a more authentic version of yourself. One last benefit that I want to highlight that has come out of this is that having defined these two dominant personas within myself, my Marc and my Steven, like I said, you're not talking to Marc or Steven, right? This exercise helped me gain distance on these stories that I was telling myself. That I would think something like, well, Marc wants this. Steven wants this. So what does Joe want? What is Joe going to do with that information? Right? And from that perspective, I find it's a lot easier to break some of that stuckness, right? To like almost be, an outside observer to yourself, which again is a bizarre experience, but yeah, strangely empowering. So, anyways, that's what I got for you guys. Hopefully that was interesting, entertaining. I feel a little bit nervous about like this whole just winging it thing. I worry if I'm just rambling too much and it's not clear, but yeah, anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, give us a follow or a rating. I think that stuff would really help. I guess before I go, maybe I'll just outline some of the things in the pipeline. Like I said, we're probably going to do a podcast about this traumatic shit that I was referencing earlier. That could be 2 podcasts. And we have some exciting things planned for that. Some things I'm frankly nervous about, but I'm hopeful that it'll work out well and that y'all will enjoy that. So yeah, 2 podcasts around this, this traumatic shit. And then, like I said, we probably want to do an update on what's been going on. There's been a lot of stuff that's been just absolutely crazy. It's been a very hard year. And then there are other people that I want to interview for the podcast. There's quite a few people that are actually leaving the program, and so those things are time sensitive. So if I'm going to talk to them, I got to talk to them soon. So anyways, all that being said, that just means I'm hopeful that, we'll be getting more content out to you. I won't make any promises, but, thank you for so much for listening to this point. I really miss, making these podcasts. And yeah, if you listen this far, then heck, dude, yeah, I really appreciate y'all. So with that, I'll let y'all go, and I'll see you on the next podcast. Bye, guys.